Audiobook excerpt from You're Welcome by Dave O'Connell, read by the author. Korean DMZ, 1968. Blue House Raid.
We were on the line less than 3 weeks when 31 North Korean commandos came through U.S. lines in an attempt to assassinate President Park Chung-Hee in his official residence, the Blue House. We later learned that they had been specially selected and trained for months. North Korea had even built a replica of the Blue House to train in. For us, it was all south of the river and somebody else's problem, but it did set us on edge that more was to come. More did, but nothing on that scale. The Army was embarrassed. A whole platoon had come through its sector and its much publicized fence, although Stars and Stripes reported consistently that the point through which they came was undetermined. If they had been able to pin it on the South Koreans, they would have. I've always been convinced that they came through my own battalion. We were the path of least resistance. The Americans were generally easier to infiltrate than the South Koreans, and my battalion was green, just getting its nerves settled and learning to cope with the bitter cold nights. I used to sit in the hilltop bunker enjoying the view and wonder where everybody else was. My battalion held the easternmost sector in the 18-mile American sector. From where I sat, the 140 miles of DMZ to the eastern coast was guarded by South Koreans, but I never saw one of them. There was a wide valley on my right that led to the river. A platoon of infiltrators could have cakewalked past me unobserved. I could only hope there was closer communication at the battalion level. I couldn't even communicate with the next guard post on the ridgeline. Enter J. Tom Graham, reporter for the Seoul Bureau of Stars and Stripes. He was a friend of Pat's, and I had met him once or twice in Seoul. I remember him as cheerful and positive, but highly skeptical of official stories, even the ones he wrote. He and a driver came to Camp Mata to investigate the raid. He, Pat, and I met at the club. His driver was a nervous wreck once the sun went down and artillery started going overhead in a weekly test firing that we had become used to. Pat and I enjoyed watching the driver barely touching his beer and tugging at Graham's sleeve every few minutes, saying, "Let's go." Graham was in no hurry. Graham's investigations resulted in a story that the Army censored heavily, but published under his byline. Graham sent his original to Overseas Weekly, a newspaper for the military but run by civilians and out of military control. This sent a general, whose name I can't remember, into a rage, and he set out to get Graham. Graham knew he was in trouble and sought protection. Before being drafted, he had been editor of a small-town Texas newspaper which had endorsed Senator Yarborough in the last election. He appealed to Yarborough for help and got it. The general was now in a bind. It's useful to remember that the appointment and promotion of generals are approved by the Senate. Now the general could not only not bring legal action against Graham, he could not do anything that looked like retaliation or punishment. He could not even send Graham down to one of the divisional newspapers in Korea. In a tradition cherished by military and civilian organizations alike, Graham was kicked upstairs. He was transferred to the Tokyo office of Stars and Stripes, where Pat and I met him again when we took leave in April. Pat stayed in touch with him for the rest of his life. The Blue House raid was a much bigger deal to us than it was in the States. The New York Times did not get around to reporting it until 3 days later. They ran a small article on page 6 and treated it as a minor, strictly Korean problem. No mention was made of where the infiltrators had come through the line. We were aware of the story because South Korea imposed curfews for a couple of weeks while its police and military hunted the infiltrators down. Only one lived. The day after the Times article, the Blue House raid was completely overwhelmed by the coverage of the Pueblo incident.